All right. Hello, and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, the Real Seeker. And today I am joined by a couple of guests. So, immediately to my left, we have David Russell. Welcome back from your vacation.
Hey, buddy, it's good to be here. Thanks for having me on, man.
Awesome. And we also, down below, we have the man of the hour, Omar Fakhoury. Hey, Omar, how's it going?
Hey, good. Thanks for having me on.
Awesome. Yeah. And I think it's been a while, so it was time to have you back. So, yeah, basically, for the audience, Omar was a former Hindu steeped in that tradition for a while, at least a decade or so. And
About 10 years. Yeah, that's about right.
10 years there. Yeah. So, and now he's got an interest in Christianity. So, we've been kind of like going over some various issues. What is kind of hindering him from believing in Christianity fully? And, we've tackled issues like the creation evolution debate, young earth creationism, that sort of thing. But this is a topic that you wanted to discuss
Mhm.
on the moral argument. You saw a show with Travis Worth, one of our friends. He was giving his version of the moral argument, and
Mhm.
you kind of wanted to go over that. So, yeah, I think what I can do at this point, I can kind of turn it straight over to you if you want to give your kind of take on the moral argument. Like, what are some of your issues that you want to discuss on that front?
Right. So I'll say this. Now, I've done more listening and watching and seeing people discuss the moral argument, and I'm glad to see that there's a lot more thought and nuance behind it than I have, prima facie been exposed to. Um, when I've seen people discuss it, they generally try to batter people with the moral argument, and it's a showmanship thing, and it's not good reasoning. They just pound people and say, okay, well, is it good to murder babies? Well, what are you going to say, right? And then if you say yes, you're evil, of course. But if you say no, then everything is relative, and if Hitler won the war, it would have all been okay. And that's the kind of argument people use that I think is very shallow and manipulative. And I've seen it used over and over and over again, and I really object to that. I still have issues with the moral argument. I've seen William Lane Craig's version of the moral argument, and I don't like it. But I also don't like syllogisms in general. But I really don't care for the argument because it makes a certain supposition. So his argument runs. Uh, so what is the argument now? I actually wrote it down here to make sure I wouldn't make a mistake. If there is no God, there's no objective morals or duties. There are objective morals and duties, therefore there is a God. Problem is, I don't really see where he actually defines objective morals or duties in the discussions I've seen him have. What is objective about them, and what is objective, period? And then actually establishing and proving that these exist.
All right, awesome. And just before I go over to David to get his take in general on the moral argument,
Mhm.
just so I understand, you don't like the tactic of kind of arguing against pure subjective relativism, that sort of thing. Do you agree with Christians and William Lane Craig, though, that pure moral subjectivism is ludicrous, though it does entail those kinds of problems?
I look at it in a very different way. I have my own moral argument, but it is not it's not syllogistic. It's not formulated that way, and it actually has two parts rather than one line of logic. I see it because we are in the flesh and we're essentially spiritual beings in the flesh. We have to look at morality as two separate issues. One as in our consciousness in the flesh and our self perception in that way. And then one from the higher perspective of the spiritual being who is trying to achieve something, higher and the good, as one might say. classic way. So I see them as different things. I can, and you know, another thing that's always kind of bothered me is I have watched lots of, whether they're atheists or not's irrelevant. I've watched a lot of people try to make a case for subjectivism, and they're terrible at it. And I have a case I can make, I think, that's very straightforward, very simple, and basically bulletproof. But no one ever makes it. People try to approach morality as a series of logical propositions, and I think it's a mistake. I don't think we approach morals that way. So we can get more into that in the show, but let's let David bring up, you know, his what he wants to put out.
Yeah, David.
Well, yeah, I don't think I can go too far with you right now because I don't know your moral argument. So I think I would love to hear your moral argument before
Right,
I really give a critique or anything like that. But
right.
what I'm getting though is that you're more you're discovering this thing as well. Like you're kind of developing your own thing here, and that I applaud that. I mean, you should be. I mean, that's
Mhm.
what we do as free thinkers. In this day and age, we come up with arguments and stuff like that.
And
And we
David,
can see if it's sound.
And
So yeah,
David,
like
if you don't mind, in your kind of
yeah.
opening statement here as well, also include like what is your take on the moral argument and
Right. My take takes
Yeah,
a little bit to develop. So, oh, are you
yeah.
talking to Dave or
I'm
me?
talking to David. Yeah,
Oh,
because this
sorry,
is
my bad, my
No,
bad.
it's okay. It's okay. It's absolutely fine, guys. And I will. I'll give my take here in a second. But what I'm getting at is you're more like I don't like the tactics of how apologists or people, even subjectivists, have gone about it. I think there's another way we can look at it.
I don't think it's absolute in the way also that they try to present it. You know, what I offer myself or what I think myself is something that's not absolute subjectivism, but it's also not absolute objectivism.
Okay. Yeah, and that's one of the things that because um I don't think having an idea of objective morality equals moral universalism, right? Like there's a moral universalism
Well,
out there.
explain what you mean by that.
So like I don't think that because I believe in objective moral values and duties,
Mm,
right? I don't think that that equates to moral universalism. So I look at morals kind of like a mathematical formula, right?
mhm.
um to get the answer, the equation to the equation, the formula, there's different variables that are involved that get you to that conclusion, right? And if the variable changes, then it's going to present a whole different value that you have to consider to get to an answer to.
What do you mean by moral universalism? You have to understand, I don't
Like
know a lot
absolutism, like
from
like a moral like absolutes, like I believe in objective morality versus absolutes. I do believe there's a set of yeah.
so how do you define
uh,
the difference between objective and absolute?
so my idea, and this is why it was going to take me a while to formulate as well.
Go right ahead.
So like I'm a defender of moral realism, right? And you have to in that there's a lot that goes into that. Like we'd have to define what moral realism is
Mhm.
and metaethics in general, right? So we'd have to go that route. But basically I think realism holds that moral judgments can be true or false, that that sometimes they are true, and that what makes them true is independent from people or people groups or groups of people, beliefs, judgments, or desires, and that's defined by Andrew Fisher in his book on moral
You
realism.
believe
On
that there
metaethics.
are morals independent from people then?
Yes, I do. Absolutely.
Okay. So what would be an example of a moral like that?
A love, I think a love is a moral value, or
I think it's moral.
yeah, I think it is moral in that sense. So there's a lot to it. So I mean, in my opinion, I think more realism would have to be defined. Metaethics would have to we'd have to kind of get into that. Then we could define more realism and defend it. So, and that's where the approach I would take first. You know, I think there's several steps that you can use, and it doesn't necessarily have to be in a syllogism. So I don't
Right.
know if I'm explaining myself well or not.
You're working towards it. I mean, you're clear, but you're still it's not nailed down yet. So what do you mean by objective?
Uh, I just read it in the moral realism. It's independent of from people or groups of people's beliefs, judgments, or desires. Dale, does that sound right to you? Am I know how
Yeah,
Craig defines it, but I define it just a little bit differently than he
I'm not
does.
sure exactly how Craig defines it.
Yeah,
yeah, that's more or less that's one of the
yeah.
major definitions of
So, okay, well, let me ask you a question. Um, this is an object, right? If I exist or I don't exist, this we reasonably believe, we're not all, crazy subjectivists. This will continue to exist. If you and I blink out of existence, if all humans blink out of existence, this object will continue to exist, right?
Right,
We
right.
can
Just like
agree
the
on
laws of logic would. Yeah,
that. Okay. So now let's take something else. This can. We can say that this can is beautifully designed or ugly designed, have an aesthetic of any kind towards it. If we stop existing, the can will exist, but does the aesthetic associated with it continue to exist? I say no. I say that aesthetic is a interaction of your consciousness with an object of consciousness. And there's an aesthetic there. And when you stop existing, that aesthetic stops existing. The can might exist, but the beauty or ugliness or utilitarianness of it ceases to exist without a subject to apprehend it and place that value on it. And I say the same thing for morals. Okay. Thou shalt not kill. Well, if there's no one to kill and no one to be killed, it becomes meaningless. It doesn't exist anymore. Saying that it's bad to steal. If there's no one to steal and nothing to steal, that has no objective existence. It's meaningless. So I see morals as something that are participatory and something that occurs in and between subjects. Otherwise, they have no meaning. You can talk about it. You can have a stone tablet with the 10 commandments on it, but if there's no one there to read it, no one there to follow it, no one there to break it, no one there to have, those acted upon or to enact them, where is it? It's meaningless.
okay.
So that's why I don't believe in objective values. That's one reason. Then the other reason I don't believe in objective morals is that morals vary. They vary from person to person and culture to culture. If you were a Hindu living in India, for example, okay, killing a cow for them is an equivalent moral crime, not intellectually, but factually in their existence as killing your own mother. So, you don't feel that way, but they do. So who's to say that your moral on that, saying it is or isn't moral, has some absolute status or some objective status?
And sorry, Omar, what was your first one? I just want to write it down.
Sure. The first one was that morality is participatory. There is a subject and there is an object being acted upon, and the moral is a participatory situation between subject and object.
Okay.
If there's no subject, then the moral value ceases to have any meaning to even talk
Okay.
about.
Yeah, that's right.
It's very much of an aesthetic.
Okay.
In a way, there's an aesthetic to it. Yeah.
Okay, and yeah, so and if you have others, continue to list what are your reasons for thinking there are not objective.
Well, and the other is the variation from person to person and culture to culture.
So two reasons total.
Yeah, it means it's not objective because who's making the list and saying it's objective? Now, if you and again, what this is why I was trying to talk to David, and this is something I like to ask William Lane Craig, is when you say that there are morality is objective,
Hmm.
okay? Do you mean that a sense of morality is what is objective, but what like a container, but what fills that container, the specific morals are subjective or individually determined, but that most people have a sense of morality? Or do you mean that there's actually a lexicon of morals that are objective and absolute and that exist in some platonic never land?
All right, cool. So I'm gonna, David, did you want to reply to that, or because I have something to say to make some
I'll
progress?
let you go. I've already been talking a little bit, so I'm just getting my.
Okay. Okay, cool. So, in some ways, before I give my view,
Mhm.
I have some things that I agree with you about, Omar, about the need for the moral subject to
Mhm.
ground um, morals, and stuff like that. But okay, so first thing, just some terminology then. So I
Right.
want to understand. Do you admit that there are such things as moral truths? There are propositions that are true or false
I,
about
I
morality.
don't. Not in the look. If A equals B, B equals A is a mathematical truth. It's a logical truth,
Mhm.
and it exists independently of us. I think. A lot of people debate about mathematics, whether that's a Platonic thing or whether people invent it. Personally, I'm more inclined to think it's Platonic, but that is objective and that's separate from us. It doesn't require us to exist. Pythagoras's theorem doesn't require us. A right angled triangle will have its properties whether we exist or not. And it will have, it can have its own intrinsic existence. Just like, if you believe in evolution at all, this world existed long before we came around on the scene. And there were physical, real things here. And I will quantify the word objective to make it simple. An objective means something which is measurable. I can measure the length and dimensions of this object, and if you apply the same standards as me at any time in history, you will come up with the exact same numbers that I do. So, objective means something which is measurable, repeatable, and independent from observation. Okay. So, or independent from an observer.
Just the kind of, I'm not going to throw you. I know what you mean, but just a side note. Scientists measurements are not repeatable. Actually, you
Well, nothing is
get small
absolutely
enough.
perfect. Of
Yeah,
course not.
I'm
But,
just yeah.
I understand that nothing is absolutely perfect, but, how many decimal places do you want to go out, right? So, of course, in the absolute sense, we live in a world of infinite granularity. Well, of course, you don't believe in infinity, but
Not an
of
actual.
tremendous granularity. And at some point, you're going to become inaccurate. But applying the same thing, you should reasonably come to the same measurement. So what I'm saying is that this object has properties that exist and can be measured separately from me or any human being or all of humanity. I'm saying the morals aren't like that. Morals implicitly require a subject. It has no meaning without a subject.
Okay.
So that makes it subjective.
Okay. So
That
you're
doesn't
not.
necessarily make it completely relativistic, but it makes it subjective.
Okay. Cool. So you're not a Platonist then when it comes to moral truths, technically.
Correct.
Okay. All right. Cool. The other thing is moral values, or sometimes they'll be expressed as principles, but really they're values. Do you think that there are moral values that exist?
Can you define what you mean by moral values? Because I don't know the official definitions, and I don't want us to be talking about different things.
Yeah, so they're moral values. So, if, in the first place, values are something that a moral agent, a subject,
Mhm.
something. It's the qualia of significance is how I define it, right? So that there's a subject that's a moral agent, and they value something. So, for example, David mentioned there's this value or principle of love, or value or principle of justice.
I see that as an aesthetic, not a moral.
You see that as an
Love is something aesthetic. I don't see it as moral. Love can lead to morality, and it can cause moral decisions. If I love my neighbor as myself, I will treat him well. Okay, I will behave morally towards him, but that love itself is not synonymous with morality.
Gotcha. I disagree, but it doesn't matter. Like,
Okay.
are there any such things as moral values, or
Sure, there are, but those are things that are agreed upon among people. And now I'm giving you my secular case. I have a whole nother case to make that's completely separate, but I'll put my secular case out there. My secular case is that morals are based on not not ideological principles. They're based on emotional reactions. We learn morals from the time we're very little. And really, as far as I can see, and I wish someone else could point something different to me because I hate it to be so reductionistically simple. But as far as I see, um, morals are all based on the principle of fairness. And what is fair, what is perceived as being fair, is what determines morals. So I'll give you a gross example. So if I walk past a biker bar and I see two 350-pound bikers beating the tar out of each other, okay, I don't have a moral approbation against it. I say, God, I don't want to be near that, but it's not really. It doesn't call up a moral sense to me. If I walk down the street and I see a 350-pound guy beating up a 9-year-old little girl, okay, instantly I feel moral outrage. And that moral outrage is because it's unfair. Two big people of similar size and disposition in a conflict doesn't cause me outrage. It might, annoy me or bother me in some way. That doesn't cause me moral outrage. The unfairness causes outrage. And moral approbation is really based heavily on a sense of fairness. And we learn that from our earliest childhood because we all know, children are narcissistic. Babies are narcissistic. It's a me, me, me world. And you have to learn to share. You have to learn what's fair. And you learn that from your parents. And that's why I have a problem with the statement, the law of God is written on the heart of man. Well, I say, okay, like I said earlier, is that a sequence of rules or is that a general principle or tendency towards morality? Those are two different things, right?
gotcha?
So, but I have a problem with that because if you say, let's do a thought experiment. If you took a baby and raised it with robots from the day it was born, fed it, cleaned it, changed it, gave it all of its physical needs for existence until it was 18 years old, and then set it loose on the world, will it be this perfect Rousseauian, loving, natural man? No.
Well, they've
It's going to be
proven
completely amoral. Will be
that's
completely
not
amoral.
true. We've scientifically proven babies have a sense of morality, even
Yes.
babies
Well,
that-
they have. Okay. How is that proven?
So they've done scientific experiments where they have like a puppet show, and these are
Right.
babies that can't even speak, and they
Right.
have one puppet treating this person what we would describe as nicely,
Mhm.
the other one, or to use your words, fairly, or something like that,
Mhm.
and then they have another puppet where they bash the other puppet on the head and treat them
Mhm.
in
Mhm.
an immoral way, and the babies react adversely to that. They don't trust that puppet.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Sure. And another point that I have in the back of my mind also is that applies to animals too. People say, well, animals don't have souls and therefore they don't have the ability to make moral judgments, but they do, and it's very clear. And they've done these experiments with apes where they have shown apes reacting with moral outrage when they're shortchanged on a reward for a task that they did and another ape did, and the other ape gets rewarded and they don't, they lose their minds. It's very clear that they have a sense of moral outrage. Anyone who's ever owned a dog or a cat knows that they have a sense of what's fair. And they react very badly when they perceive something as not being fair to them. So even animals have a sense of fairness, and babies have this sense too, but it's still narcissistic. It's still in relation to themselves, right? To understand as a moral agent that, I can't have all the M&Ms. I have to share the M&Ms because it's fair. That's something you learn. That's not just inherent. That's something you learn from your parents. That's something you learn from your family. And we have plenty of examples of people in prisons all over the world who weren't taught that, who were taught something else, and they continued that behavior through their life. So, yeah, that's something learned, and it's agreed upon socially.
Okay, agreed upon. Okay, so that's what I want.
Social contract, but I'm saying it is agreed upon. And I think that the universality of morality that people tend to talk, and tell me if I'm talking too much, the universality of morality that people perceive. People say, look, killing babies is wrong. Everybody knows it everywhere. This is wrong. That's wrong. It's universally perceived. A long time ago, a professor really helped us understand what an archetype was. And because she was a Jungian professor, and archetypes are not something baked into your DNA, they're not baked into your genes, you're not born with it, but you have a propensity, and things occur consistently in civilization to civilization, independently, spontaneously, that are the same. So, for example, the classic archetype of the mother. Well, everywhere you go, look what you got. You got a mother. So you're going to have a mother archetype. It doesn't mean that it's inborn in you, but it's inborn in your circumstances. And so it's going to naturally occur in a similar way from place to place and culture to culture. So I think the universality of morality is more like that than to say that if you took a person, raised him on the moon, and then brought him back to the world, that they would somehow have all the same morals that everybody here does.
Okay. So this is my last question on the terminology then, because
Mhm.
my plan of action is I'm first wanting to assess William Lane Craig's
Sure.
version of the argument. Then I'd give mine, and then then I would assess yours, and then I would give my thing. So, okay. So moral duties, kind of like deontology, moral rules. Are there moral duties in your opinion and on your view?
They are, but they're socially determined, right? I mean, what exactly do you mean by a moral duty? Like that a husband should take care of his wife? Is that a moral duty? That's a duty. But I when I've dated a more modernly raised woman, I try to open the door for her to the car. They say, "Don't do that for me. It's condescending." you know. But at another time and place, if you didn't open the door for them, you think you're the biggest jerk in the world. So that's a small example of a moral duty, a chivalrous duty. It's clearly being determined by society and societal expectations. It's not a universal that exists out in the world independently from us.
Gotcha. Okay. Okay. Cool. So looking at because William Lane Craig does like premises, and I think these are helpful.
Mhm.
I don't like the way he words his first premise, so I'm going to change it into
Sure.
a different one. But it's basically the same thing, right? So if objective moral values exist, then God exists. Premise two, objective moral values do exist, therefore God exists. So we've spent a lot of time. We get that you deny premise two, that objective moral values exist. You don't think that there are objective in the way he's defining. What about premise one? Do you think that if objective
Well,
moral values,
here's the problem with why his argument is the circular argument. It's a very poorly constructed argument because it's assuming for things to exist objectively, it presupposes, in a way, a creator, doesn't it? For something that is non-physical to exist objectively implies God inherently, right? I mean, I can talk about a rock, or a gas nebula floating in space and make a case to say, well, there's no God, the universe spontaneously popped into existence, which I think is baloney. But I'm saying that even if you start from that premise, you can say there's no God, but physical objects exist. But you want to talk about morals, that's not a physical object. That's not a part of the physical world. So you are inherently implying the existence of God in premise one, which you're using to get to statement three, which is now a circular argument.
So I'll just so I'll just clarify again. It's not a circular argument. I know for a fact it's not. That I get this is what I do. I
Sounds like
teach
it to me.
Jake.
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead. I'd like to hear
Because
you.
he's not. He gives arguments or reasons as to why premise one is true, as to why if objective moral values exist, then that necessitates God's existence, and he considers other
Well, but
options.
the problem with that is that his argument is not to prove the existence of morals, it's to prove the existence of God.
Yeah,
The first statement presupposes God's existence, which is the very thing you're trying to prove.
it doesn't.
You
It says
can't presuppose it.
so this is a very common mistake, right?
Uh-huh.
That's it's saying if God exists. And
I know he couches it with that, he hedges it, but still, if you accept his if premise, then you've already accepted the existence of God. Just by accepting his if statement, you have inherently, implicitly existed. Like if I say, if Daryl's sunglasses exist, is obvious. If I say, okay, I accept that. Well, now I've existed not only Daryl's sunglasses, but Daryl.
Yeah.
So there you go.
Yeah, I agree
So,
that
it's a circular argument. He's presupposing the existence of God in his if statement. And to even get to the second statement, you have to accept his first statement.
okay. So yeah, very well. I will just my opinion. He's definitely not begging the question, but perhaps in the way I've stated it, you can reject the truth of the premise and say the premise is wrong because even if
I'm not even trying to reject the truth of the premise. I'm saying that in that argument, that premise is a non-starter because he's trying. It's not about whether I accept that statement. It's the fact that that statement is not the right building block for the argument. Because again, identifying something non-physical, non-measurable, non-physical, even in an if statement, if I accept the if statement, that part of the statement, which is the, if objective, if there are objective more, what is the statement now? Now I screwed
so
myself.
I'm switching because I don't like the way William Lane Craig.
Okay, well, what is your statement?
So if objective moral values and duties exist, then God exists.
Right. So now let's dissect that. What you're really saying is if something subjective is objective, God exists. The only way for something subjective to be objective is to have an external referent, which is God. So that statement itself presupposes the existence of God, even as an if statement, and therefore you can't use it to build the argument because you're begging the question. You're assuming the thing that you're trying to prove.
Gotcha. Yeah, I get what you're trying to say. It's just I know that's not what he's.
It might not be what he means, and he might not have considered it from that perspective, but that's what I see it doing.
Fair enough. Then okay. Well, forget about the begging the question, the fallacies.
Okay.
Let me just ask you though. Let's pretend we prove that moral values are indeed objective in the sense that he argues for, right? And I'm going to be agreeing with you. I don't think
I still don't understand what he's arguing for. I don't know what he means. If by objective values, moral values, he means that morals and values that exist independently of any subject, which is all of us, and we're not going to include God in that, but if they exist independently from us, like, look, this world exists independently from us. If we disappear, it keeps going. Okay. So, in the same way, if morals and values have an independent existence from us, then because they're not physical objects, they need a subject. We've already agreed that morals and values need a subject. So implicitly, if the subject's not me or you, it's God. There has to be a subject for it. If you say that beauty is an objective thing, beauty exists. Okay, so wipe out all humans and beauty still exists. It requires a subject to apprehend beauty. And when you wipe out all the little subjects with the small s, you're only left with God. So it implies the existence of God, which I don't think is a bad or wrong thing. I just think it's the wrong way to build the argument. So that's why I hate syllogisms, and I don't like that argument.
Well, okay, so the point that I'm trying to get across to you is he doesn't just assume God is the only subject that can ground it, right? He's ruling out all humans, but what about aliens? What about
all the little s's, everything that's contingent?
Yeah,
all of the little subjects, everything that's contingent, me, you, aliens, microbes, dogs, cats, anything that is contingent is
right.
a subject with a little s.
Okay. So I'm trying to make
if you remove all those subjects to discuss moral values as being objective, that has to be apprehended. What I'm saying is they can't be completely objective and independent of their own. They're participatory and they require a subject. Whether it's a subject with a little s, who's a contingent subject, me, you, or Marvin the Martian, or God, the big S. Okay. But they still require a participation of consciousness.
Okay, so I think the way to get past this, let me state where I agree with you, and then I'm going to bring in David. But okay, so I totally agree with you, right? When it comes to aesthetic values or moral values and that sort of thing, I think that the experiencing subject is indeed necessary in part to ground those things.
Mm-hmm.
I also think, so I take a view called dispositional realism, or ethical dispositional realism, which basically says, look, in order to ground moral values and duties, it requires, and moral truths, moral truths require a mind that knows the propositions. Moral values requires an experiencer that experiences the qualia of significance of fairness versus unfairness, right? So the subject is needed to ground, but I think that the objects or the states of affairs and their properties are also equally needed to ground these moral values and truths, because they are what they are what the subject reacts to, right? So if I'm reacting to Hitler as a moral agent and he has certain properties, I disvalue him and I make a judgment Hitler is immoral.
Right.
So his properties are also necessary, or states of affairs, where someone gets killed. Oh, that states of affairs are immoral. That's evil. That's bad.
No, wait a minute. If you get killed by a boulder falling off of a cliff and get smashed, that's not immoral. I don't think most people would agree that is not immoral. It's non-desirable, but it's not evil, bad, or
I admit I'm bringing in my Christian theism, right? Because the fall, all of the consequences, natural evils, things, there's no distinction. It's all they're all evil. So that I admit that the majority of philosophers would agree with you and not me by bringing in some of my Christian lens when I say that. Okay, great. So I do admit that in order to ground these things, we do need a subject, right? So then it's a question of, well, who is the best candidate for that subject that grounds these things, that has these reactions in response to certain objective states of affairs or objects? And this is where William Lane Craig argues that God is the best. It's obviously not human beings and I would also argue it's not societies. There are problems with that. It wouldn't be something like atheistic moral Platonism, and William Lane Craig gives reasons for that. So the thing I'm trying to establish with you is that if William Lane Craig provided convincing reasons, then the premise would be true. Would you agree with the premise if he can convince you that all the other options apart from God don't work in some way?
Yeah, but the no, I'm still not. It's still not working for me because without without some kind of subject, whether it's me or whether it's God, okay, talking about a state of affairs as being moral or immoral is meaningless. So, if somehow we were allowed the universe to exist independently of God and me and you,
Mhm.
okay, take all subjects out of it, okay? If a rock falls off a cliff and breaks a dog's leg and crushes it to the ground and forces it to starve to death and get eaten by maggots while it's still alive, is that evil? Is that bad? No, because there's no subject or agent to apprehend it and give it that meaning. So with it falls apart without a subject. You can't use the subject to establish the existence of the moral or value, then remove the subject and suppose the value to continue existing.
Exactly.
Yeah,
And
but
that's what
yeah,
dispositional. Sorry,
yeah.
Dave. One sentence, and then over
Okay,
to you.
guys.
So, and that's what ethical dispositional realism states. You need
Uh,
both to
yeah,
ground these things. So, David, over to you, and I will
but I
shut
think
up.
one is
Yeah, but don't you think see, I can't even get on board with your line of thought though, because if
okay.
you're gonna take away the very if you're saying, okay, let's take away God, let's take it the morals don't mean anything, right? But if you take away God, then you're taking away everything that grounds reality to
Well,
begin
I
with.
understand. What I was saying was just
You know what I mean?
was
So
saying
like if
hypothetically.
I
I was
can't,
saying
but you
hypothetically,
can't think
even
like
if
that.
you could.
You can't even think hypothetically like that
But what I'm
because you're
saying is that
taking existence. God is responsible for all existence.
well, I'm not
That's yeah,
disagreeing with that. I'm not
yeah.
disagreeing with that. What I'm saying is there's 2 different things. One is believing that God exists as the supreme subject. The other is trying to prove God's existence without presupposing it in that little syllogism.
Mhm.
And what I'm saying, that syllogism is poorly constructed because step one necessitates the existence of some subject, whether it's me and you or whether it's the absolute subject, to give that objective state to morals. What I'm saying, what he's doing is a shell game. He's talking about morals existing. While you talk about morals existing, you have to have a moral observer, agent, experience, or whatever you want to call it. You can't then remove that person and hope that it will continue to exist. It's like propping up a ball on a stick and pulling the stick out and hoping the ball will continue to float in the air. It's not going to happen. So the subject is necessary for the continuance and for the very existence of that moral experience or for that qualia.
Yeah.
You can't then remove them and say, okay, now we're going to talk about it as objective. We're going to make it objective. We'll start with it being subjective and then remove the subject and talk about it as an abstracted objective. You can't do that.
Yeah. So what I was just saying was that, um, as far as the argument goes, I see where you're coming from. But
Yeah.
like as far as argument goes, I just don't think you can divorce those two and still have a hypothetical where
No, you
those
can't.
two
That
things,
was
yeah,
my very point.
yeah.
That you can't. You
Like
can't. You have to
like I
have.
don't think you can have reality if you take away God. You know what I mean? It's just
Of course.
and thus we
That's my
can't
point.
even
That,
discuss
that's exactly.
because you can't equate nothing with
But you're making my
the
point.
morals. Yeah.
You're
Yeah, I
making.
know. And that's what I'm
Yeah.
thinking. And what I'm thinking here is that we're kind of speaking past each other
Mhm,
in a
mhm.
way. And but I think what you're saying is that I just think we're doing it in a long roundabout way is that William Legs Craig's argument just isn't detailed enough.
It sucks. No, it's not just not detailed enough. It's actually fallacious. It's a bad argument.
I can't say that. I mean,
It's based on a carnival
it
trick.
could be a bad argument,
Yeah,
but I know it's sound and it's valid, but it's yeah,
but it's not sound and valid. You might agree with his conclusion, and you might say his conclusion is sound and valid, but his argument that he uses to get there is invalid, and that's two different things.
So
You've already agreed with me
yeah,
that
well,
to
all
talk
three of
about any kind of to assign any kind of objectivity to morals or values, you have to still imply a subject. So if you remove people from it, then you've got God implied in the statement. And so you can't prove God's existence and imply it at the same time. You're trying to it's begging the question, right? You can't assume the existence of the thing you're trying to prove when you're trying to prove it. So that's why I'm saying his argument sucks.
okay.
yeah, I'll let you take that.
Yeah, no, again, I don't want to get into I promise you, Omar, he's not begging the question. Okay. I
Okay.
promise he's not, but there is still that question. And all
Mhm.
three of us, we all agree. William Lane Craig would agree with you as well. In order to answer the question, what grounds moral truths, moral value, and moral
Right,
values, and moral duties as well, which
right.
are derivative of the values, you need a moral subject or agent. And
So then
in order,
how is it then? Let's move forward then.
well,
Let's
I'm
let's
about
let's
to.
let's
I've
stop
got something.
beating up William Lane Craig. Right.
Well,
So
here's what I wanted to say. The last
do it,
point I wanted to ask
do
you
it.
about, because I think this will help us move forward. And the way I like to is not in terms of objective versus subjective moral values and truths.
Mhm.
I like to look at it from the perspective of necessary moral values and truths. These are things that apply in every possible world. They're eternal and they are logically necessary. They are true in every possible
Okay.
world.
Now,
Or
when you talk about those necessary morals, values, and truths, is that necessarily there is morality as a category? Or is it that there is a lexicon of necessary moral values and truths that you could write a big volume of and outline them and label them and assign a specific statement to? Running a stop sign is immoral, whatever. Make a list of them. And is that what you're saying? That there's actually this objective list because you're going to wind up with an infinite list?
well, potentially infinite, but yes. So that is what I'm saying, right? This moral subject exists in all possible worlds. He has the same moral values and disvalues in all possible worlds. He has the same moral knowledge, the same true propositions. This is immoral. If there was a stop sign and you ran it, that would be immoral. These are necessary truths that are true in all possible worlds, and this conscious subject has all these values or disvalues in all possible worlds. So
But,
this means the
but
being,
isn't that
the
easily refuted? I
I'm
mean,
sorry.
again, but isn't that easily refuted by saying that people in different places will have categorically different morals? If for example, I was watching an anime yesterday, and what happened in this, it was, I can't remember the guy's name, very famous director. It was the one, Grave of the Fireflies. And something happened in there, and I don't even remember what it was. It was so uniquely Japanese that I said, "Oh wow!" It jarred me because the people in the anime were so offended. I think the kid was just running through a crowd and bumped into someone. They were so offended. It was just this horrible moral breach. And I'm like, "Oh wow, that was really Japanese." Or if you walked into a Japanese person's house with shoes on, they would be aghast. I don't let people in my house with shoes on. I don't want my carpets wrecked, right? But more than that, it would be considered a horrible disrespect. You might as well take a poop on their dining room table. I mean, you walk in with shoes on, you are insulting them personally. You're not just carrying dirt and germs in, it's a personal insult. Now, you might not feel that way if someone walks into your apartment with shoes on. Why does this person have such a strong feeling and you don't? And which one of you is morally correct?
Yeah, and here's my problem with that, Omar, is that
Okay.
again, you said this purely and clearly. Humans aren't perfect, right?
Hmm.
We don't think that as a moral realist. I don't think that they're not dependent. Morals aren't dependent on humans, but discovered by them, right? So I think moral actions between humans are just manifestations of objective moral facts.
So you believe that there's
So
the
what I think,
morality.
I think that when it comes to morality, like I said earlier, each part of a mathematical equation, so to speak, determines the right solution. So, like, because we're not perfect, we're not going to get it right. But just because we have these moral interactions, I do think are manifestations of that idea that there are objective moral facts.
Yeah, but how will you ever know what they are? If everyone, it's kind, isn't it kind of meaningless to assume them if you're never going to know, if you can't ever really define what they are? Because
No, because have you ever heard of moral convergence?
no, what do you mean by that?
So when you take out a lot of the stuff, moral there's not as much disagreement as you think.
Oh, I understand that.
So
There's a lot of
yeah,
universality, but I'll tell you what, if you went back, and met Genghis Khan and his buddies, okay, and you lived in that society that swept over, what, 2/3 of the world,
right.
okay, they have a whole different morality than you do, and
Not necessarily. There's a lot of
yeah, they
convergence still.
no, well, there is convergence,
There's
but
a
the only
lot of
idea
convergence throughout
what I'm
time,
saying
and
is
this has been proven.
but the convergence, the overlap of that Venn diagram is not what creates the problem. What
But it
creates the problem is the fact that there are parts that don't overlap, but you're assuming an absolute that somehow everyone will come to the same moral conclusion, being a moral being, but they don't.
Not absolute. No, no, not at all. Like I said, I don't think you're getting the part where I'm saying it's like a mathematical equation. This is my idea of objective morality is like that. It takes different uh uh parts of the equation that determine the right solution, right? So, and I think you can get there, just like you can
Do you really think
get to the right
morality?
conclusion in mathematics. So, like when you're talking about Genghis Khan, I'll give you a better example.
Okay,
Okay, so you have a more modern example where a tribe in Africa
mhm,
would have deformed children and think they're demons, right? And then they would kill them and bury
sure,
them under a temple, right? So the thing is, Genghis Khan, he would pillage, do his thing, right?
right.
But the thing is, he wouldn't kill his own mother because that would be wrong. That would be killing, right?
Well,
So,
you
and
know,
I'm not
the
saying
Roman
this. I'm
Empire,
giving a
man, they were
hypothetical,
killing
right?
their
So,
brothers, their mothers, and
but
fathers.
here's the thing: this tribe in Africa believed that killing the healthy children were wrong
Well, dude,
because
you don't
and
have to
they
go
just
to
but
Africa.
the
Look
thing
at
is
the
they just
abortion clinics
and yeah,
here in America.
yeah, we don't. But the point it remains is that there's a difference between getting the moral facts wrong and getting them right. And a lot of these things where it comes to convergence is a lot of people getting the moral facts wrong. Dale, go ahead.
What the
I'm
hell,
sorry.
yeah.
Yeah, I just want to contribute. So, okay, so for the first thing I want to mention here, again, the moral argument, first of all, this is kind of a side note because moral epistemology isn't relevant to moral ontology, which is what the moral argument is
Mhm.
about. So it could be maybe, let's say God exists and he's the foundation of morality and he didn't design humans to do that. Obviously, as a Christian, I can't say that. So
Mhm.
I do think we have, as Christians, we also have to answer this moral epistemology question. And as David's been saying, the problem is greatly exaggerated by atheists. There are, when you evaluate that sort of thing, there are three levels or
Mhm.
causes of moral disagreement that ethics professors have noted, right?
Mhm.
Philosophers. So, okay, there's factual disagreements, right? In abortion, is that thing a living human with a soul or not? That
Mhm.
can create moral disagreements. There are also genuine disagreements, though not as much as you might think, but on values. There are genuinely people in abortion that say, no, the principle of autonomy
Right, right,
is
right,
more
right,
important than a principle of life preservation.
right.
And then there's also okay, so that's the other one, moral hierarchy
Right.
kind of thing.
So
But
with that, then we do have moral relativity. Okay, I'm not going to talk about absolute moral relativism because you can't talk about absolute relativism. That's ridiculous. It's an oxymoron. But you do have and of course we're bringing a lot of nuance into it. Again, the thing that I was objecting to was the sledgehammer, simplistic, moronic ABC arguments that people would try to make to make a moral argument for God's existence, and they would treat morality as such a simple black and white issue. You're either objective and absolute, or you're a relativist, and all relativism swirls down into the solipsistic toilet flush of meaninglessness. And anyone who believes in objective absolute morals is immediately talking about God. And people make it so simplistic and so, horribly presented. And that was really the thing that set me off when I first contacted you, because I kept running into people doing this. Even what's his name? Oh, God, I forget his name now. The Alpha Omega guy.
James White.
James White, he does that, and I just want to smack him because I've seen him do that. He's much smarter than that, or he should be. And I've seen him make arguments exactly that way, and it's terrible.
I just want to be fair. So I totally agree with your point that it's not that simplistic, but
It's not.
I do want to acknowledge that there's a place for these apologists to do that, because there are Richard Dawkins, textbook statement of that view. So maybe it's an easy position to refute, but it does need to be refuted because there are people that hold that. But
Well, what position?
right.
Relativism? I mean, I still think that morality is, in one level, can be defended secularly as a relative cultural phenomenon, and it doesn't make it terrible. It is defensible.
So here I'm going to present one argument.
I've got a whole other argument.
Well, yeah, but Dale,
that.
I don't think we're going to get too far unless we actually hear what his argument is and be able to go through it.
So just one question then, because if I'm going to try to argue for necessary moral truths or values or something like that, right? I do think that just citing one case where we agree we have knowledge in this case, right? So not just that you agree, but that we actually have knowledge that it's immoral. And the textbook example is used as torturing babies for fun. I think that is a provable, necessary truth. I cannot use my modal evaluating faculties to think of any possible world or any possible set of circumstances where torturing an innocent baby for fun is considered moral in any way.
Well, I can, not by me, certainly, and certainly not by anyone in this conversation, but I'll tell you, for example, when in World War II, when the Japanese invaded China, their soldiers would take their samurai swords and skewer Chinese babies on the swords and laugh. It happened. It was documented. So apparently some people thought that was just A-okay.
Yeah, but they would be wrong. Right.
Well, for me, absolutely.
No, see, but now you're inserting a relativistic idea.
The thing is because I have an intense moral, personal, emotional reaction to something, does not give me the logical and philosophical right to say, therefore, it's absolute and it's true.
Okay, one last follow-up question, then we're going to transition and let you give your argument for the next part. But okay, so I think that you are you're kind of making an assumption. So I'd like you to back this up. That the Japanese, when they scared those babies, they saw it as the morally right thing.
No.
Do I think
they didn't see it as morally right. They didn't see it as morally wrong. They just didn't see it as they didn't see it as immoral. They just did it out of pure sadism. And it's not just those soldiers that did it. That kind of thing has been done in history. It certainly wouldn't be the first time.
How do you know they didn't do it because they saw there was a greater good, or like that? Obviously they were fighting for their
I don't see that baby as posing any kind of direct threat to them. I don't think they decided that this baby could grow up and threaten me and my children, therefore is my moral duty to kill it now. It's possible that someone thought like that. Let's see what people are saying here.
Richard Hunter. Yeah, I can bring in a question from Rich. We shouldn't lose sight.
Shows up the MA to fall very far short as a proof.
The moral argument is supposed to be a proof.
Proof should be formed out of premises which are already universally accepted. He makes a valid point there.
Mm.
But Um, so, in that specific case, I can't tell you what they were thinking. I can't tell you what you're thinking right now. I certainly can't go back 80 years and tell you what someone was really thinking and feeling. All I can do is infer. But I'm not trying to say whether I think that act was moral or immoral. For me, it's completely immoral. But I'm saying that here is a person who did not find it immoral. And then we can also, use defective people like sociopaths as an example, who have the only thing they find immoral is anything that bothers them, anything that affects them negatively, right? So there is a relativistic aspect to morality, and we can't, just because we have an intense personal reaction to something and it feels absolute to us, that doesn't justify us to posit, therefore, that this is an absolute objective truth. Even
Yeah,
though, you see what I'm saying? There's
I
a
do.
difference between
That's why
difference
it's got to
between
be
making a
knowledge.
philosophical proposition and having an ethical reaction to something.
Right. And it's
Or
not just
an emotive response, and
Yeah,
we would be against emotivism too, because again, as I would argue, I would
okay.
establish moral realism first, right? And I would do that in probably, I mean, it'd take a lot longer than we have today on this show, but like, I would establish it that way. The reason I can say skewering those Chinese babies wrong comes from a list of reasons that make up, and it's not just emotivism.
But
So there's a list of reasons, and
I
maybe
just
some
don't
people get that wrong. So, but
I just
anyways,
don't believe that people make moral decisions based on formulaically. We make it emotionally, and I believe that immorality and values are an emotional thing that later gets codified into principles. Okay, but that's after the fact. You have a gut reaction first. Never is there a case where you don't have a gut reaction first. Even if someone said, "Look, you're driving down the road and your tire blows out and you're going 60 miles an hour, and you can either run into a crowd of nuns or crash into a telephone pole and sacrifice yourself." You don't sit there and go, well, philosophically, what is more appropriate? The 6 lives of the nuns or my one life? No, you have an emotional reaction. Oh my God, I can't hit them. Bam, you sacrifice yourself. Okay, it's emotional. And all moral decisions are emotional. And they're
yeah, I would say
codified later. They're later, after the fact, post hoc. They're codified into principles, and you can go back and try to reverse engineer, some kind of argument for why you did what you did, but you really did it because you had an emotional reaction.
okay. Well, yeah, we're not saying that intuition doesn't have its place, but also so does experience, and like I said, again, moral actions between humans, like I said, are just manifestations of the fact that there is objective moral facts. So I mean, I wouldn't. We could get deeper into that, but I'll hand it over to Dan.
I actually wrote a paper in my grad seminar on the philosophy of emotions, where
Uh-huh.
I explained what is the role of emotions in providing us with moral knowledge. Is there any? My argument was that it we were designed for them to present us with moral knowledge on the moral values, not the specific duties or the specific things necessarily what we should do in any given case. That's, I
Mhm.
think, primarily propositional, but I think they do play a role. Obviously, our emotions are corrupted by sin, so there's differences and stuff like that. But yeah, all right, cool. So we've kind of defended William Lane Craig. Tried to present an
Mhm.
approach for how I would prove there are necessary moral values and truths. And I think you admitted you can't prove that there's not, but I think you were saying, but that example with the Japanese, I can't prove that it is a necessary thing. It's possible these guys differ. So I want to transition now.
Okay.
Let's go to your argument. What are you trying to prove now? So yeah.
So, what my premise is, and I know you disagree with this, is that we are embodied souls, that we are consciousness, we're a ghost in the machine, we're consciousness within a body. And that consciousness fundamentally is pure and whole. Okay, it's an infinitesimal particle of consciousness. Each one of us is, which is pure and whole in itself. And this, our flesh becomes the vehicle for us to engage with the world. And we have, fundamentally, we project our sense of self into the body, right? Just like you get in your car, you identify the car with yourself, you identify your family with yourself. You know, if you're driving your car and someone rear ends your car, you say, you hit me, right? Instinctively, you expand the bubble of yourself around the car, and the bubble of ourself is most tightly expanded around the body and the flesh. And so you've got two different things. You have, outwardly speaking, okay, in terms of engaging with the world, we determine things to be moral and immoral in relation to the flesh. You know, if a, there's, in the Vedic literature, there's a saying that, if a chicken gets killed by a fox in the wood, nobody cares. But if the farmer's chicken gets killed by a fox, he's outraged, right? Because it's his chicken. It's an extension of his own self. That chicken is within the bubble of his self. So we project ourselves out into the world, into the body and into the world, and we make decisions about right and wrong relative to the body. And there's different layers to that. There's different levels to it. There's the sensual level, which is like, strawberry cheesecake is very good. Okay, I don't know how any people in the world who would say it's bad, but you know what? At another level, the level of intelligence, it is bad, right? It's bad for your body. It's bad for your health. There's nothing good for you about it. So a thing can be good or bad depending on what order of reality you're talking about, what level you're talking about, and again, it's in relation to the body and the mind. That's one layer of morality. That's the morality we typically deal with. Okay, it's wrong to steal my stuff. It's wrong to punch me in the face. We make these right and wrong judgments based on our projection of our sense of self into the bubble in the world around us. Then there is our internal nature, which is whole and pure and good. So we always have, whether we realize it or not, a tendency and a wanting to search for the good and for a sense of completion and rightness, because it's our nature. And the thing that messes us up is when we project our timeless whole nature into things that are, ephemeral and incomplete, and fraught with all kinds of problems. And then it gives us grief and distress, and it causes us also moral issues. So we have two different directions, and that's why I said that this forks two ways. You have to look at consciousness as embodied and how it's reacting in the flesh. And then you have to look at its intrinsic nature and what that leads us towards. And that's why people strive for the good. They strive for aesthetics. Even if you're an atheist, you want some kind of aesthetic. And that longing for an aesthetic, whole and good, that is a reflection of us expressing our own internal nature. And so that's the bifurcated, moral system that I see.
All right, awesome, David. Good.
I don't think he's too far from. I think there may be some categorical issues in what we've said previously, but what you just said, I don't think a moral realist would have a problem with that necessarily, because you're assuming moral truths within the very argument itself. What I don't understand is how you can say that this can apply to something akin to naturalism. I don't think it can, because if you prove
No, no,
moral
no. I
realism,
was saying
yeah,
these are two different things.
yeah,
This argument and then the other argument are two separate things. All I want to say with the secular argument that I was making
yeah,
is that I see people like Richard Dawkins and these other people
right,
trying to argue about morality, or Christopher Hitchens, or you pull a name out
yeah,
of a hat.
Same
And
here.
they always
oh yeah.
talk about it as a series of logical propositions.
Hmm. I
And
understand that,
that's what it is.
but
And
don't you see what
so
they're doing
I
though?
can make a much better case that is completely secular,
Yeah.
and it's just from sociobiology.
Can I
Yeah,
ask
but
some
the thing is,
clarifying?
they equate like things like badness and pain together. They equate them together. Like, is pain bad? Well, why is pain bad? I mean, if moral badness was logically equivalent to pain, it would be redundant to ask if pain was bad.
Of course.
So it's just it just goes that route. So,
Only
and
one
that's a GE
side of
Moore
it.
thing. That's what GE Moore thing. But let me give it to Dale, because I know he's raising his hand. He's got
Yeah,
something to say.
Let Omar answer quickly, and then I have a clarifying question for your view
answer what?
after.
Let me answer what?
Oh, if you had something to say to David, but if you don't,
No,
know.
I was just saying I was amplifying his point that if I've got a rotten tooth in my mouth and it's going to have an infection get into my blood and go to my brain and cause me to have, a brain infection, well, the pain of pulling my tooth out is now not bad, is it? So pain and bad that's very simplistic, and that's an example of a person who is living purely on
Yeah.
the physical platform.
Well, I think
The whole
you do
consciousness
that with
is
fairness
being
too. You do that
uh,
with your idea. You do that with your idea of fairness too. Is what I'm trying to say. Is what I was trying to
sure,
say. We
yeah,
can't
fair
equivocate
again,
that
but
and stuff like that. But anyways, I
that's
know what you're saying.
yeah, that's the fleshy side, right? We're all in flesh. We all have this flesh, and we have this embodied nature. So when that fairness is relative in relation to our body, right? Which we perceive as ourself. So is it fair, or unfair? It's always in relation to the body, right? 350-pound guy, 9-year-old little girl, guy's punching the little girl in the face. Why is it unfair? It's because she's physically smaller. It's all based on the body. And that doesn't mean it's not true. I'm
Yeah,
saying
and that's the
that
thing,
if you
and that's
go
what
around and
where I
beat up
would come
little
back,
girls,
is that we were yeah. Well, I'm going to amplify your point now, like in a
okay,
way. So, like what I'm saying is that I think that that's your idea that you're saying, hey, this isn't fair. That's because there's an objectivity to that fairness, and that's where
I don't think
where I'm
it has
at.
to be objective. It's
I think it has
emotionally
to be.
felt.
I think it
Yeah.
has to
No,
be
you can
in so many
abstract
ways.
it that way.
Otherwise, I'm just equating fairness
Well,
with whatever it is,
a
whatever that
chimpanzee does
had a
not
notion
have
or
a categorical concept of fairness. He is as far away from that as we are from the other side of the galaxy.
but like you
Okay,
said, it doesn't mean that
Still
fairness doesn't
feels,
exist.
but he still has that emotive reaction,
Of
right?
course, that's all
So,
part of it.
but yeah, but what he can't abstract it or perceive it as an abstracted thing, or he's not even in touch with anything like that. So I'm saying it's not necessary. Right? To have a sense of fairness
No.
does not require the abstract category of that which is fair with a big F.
Again, and that's where I would
That
disagree.
after the fact,
I think it's a manifestation of that fact. But anyways, Dale, go ahead, man. I'm sorry.
yeah,
I've been
yeah,
Oh, I wanted to ask two clarifying questions
mm-hmm,
just to see if I understand. So, something you said was very interesting, right? So you had the in this bifurcation, there's this consciousness which is pure, and that ultimately is what orients us towards the good and that sort of
yeah.
thing. But then you also said the categories of moral versus immoral are just solely in the flesh. So how do
No,
you reconcile?
no, that's not what I said.
Okay,
Moral in our categories of moral and immoral. Well, solely in the flesh.
it's a
It's
function.
in relation. It's in relation. We have a sense of moral. Let me define two different things. I'm going to make two different categories: the good and right and wrong, moral and immoral. Right and wrong are relative to the flesh. If you take the flesh out, there's no more right and wrong, right? Because now you don't even have a vehicle for it. So it exists in that sphere. That's where it's relevant, because if you didn't have the flesh, if you didn't have a body, well, you couldn't act morally, right? So it becomes irrelevant. It becomes meaningless. There's nothing you can talk about if you're not, if you, in terms of moral and immoral, if you don't have a body to act morally or immorally with. So
And
it's in relation to the body.
Well,
and
Dale, he in this question, Dale. Let me just clarify this in a way. Maybe I'm making sense here. Maybe this will help us get along. Is what you just presented, Omar? Is the is all problem the what is versus the oughts, right? So that's kind of where I'm seeing this right now.
I don't understand your point.
What you were just saying is you're basically presenting the is all problem. What is like kind of like natural sciences, like versus oughts, like moral values and duties, right? Dale, you kind of understand what I'm saying?
yeah, you're trying to get
Yeah.
into the is ought thing, and that I was going to be getting there as well, because I was uh trying to say, like, it's almost like the consciousness, the good. Again, before I knew you made a distinction, which I'm not sure I would agree with. I think the spirit can do actions and do sins as well, and stuff like that.
Well, no, but only when it's in a body.
No,
How can you sin if you don't have a body?
we have disembodied spirits that can sin all the
No,
time.
well, I would call that a subtle body.
Okay.
It's still, they're still within the material realm. They're still in this sphere, and they're still connected to this reality and projecting themselves into it. Whether it's a subtle body that they're inhabiting or a gross physical body, it's a different type of embodiment.
Okay. So, what's the difference then between what does it even mean then at the ultimate level of consciousness?
Hmm.
It does. I can't even make heads or tails out of what goodness would mean. Then it seems to
But
lose
because
all.
goodness is a an as the highest aesthetic perception or sense we have of our nature. Our nature is inherently that. It doesn't require a label. It doesn't require a lexicon or definitions. It doesn't require an other than God, an external agency. So we are inherently pure and good in that consciousness. So when we approach it, when we talk about it, when we try to experience it in this world, we can only do it through abstraction, right? I mean, we do it through abstraction, and the closest thing we have is the aesthetic of the good,
Okay.
and that's what we strive for. But really, the good is just that spiritual completion, and that nature,
That
right?
perception. Okay,
Right.
that so I get what you're saying then. So then that leads to what David was bringing up, because you do
Mhm.
have this is ought problem, right? Because you mentioned there the various levels, and what's good or right versus wrong depends on what level you're perceiving things from, right?
Yes.
How do you get this ought? I mean, this perception of goodness. How does this lead to an ought at lower levels, whereby I ought to do the right thing versus the wrong thing? And
Mhm. Mhm.
I don't. I
That's a
haven't.
that's a very good question. That's a very good question, and, I guess it depends in some ways on the frame of reference. Um, for example, I ought to pay my taxes. So that ought is only and solely in relation to my perception as a member of a society where there are rules and regulations, and I ought to pay my taxes, and if I don't, then I get caught and I get, taken to court, and my wages garnished for life, and my credit score goes to heck. So that particular ought, I think most people would agree that it's not absolute, right? In heaven, no one cares about taxes. It's irrelevant, but it's relevant here. So it's relevant in that sphere. But they're also behind that ought is the subject or the self who's experiencing the ought. and that's a different thing. And that interrelationship between the projected sense of self as a member of society and our true self creates that sense of ought. Does that make sense? The ought doesn't exist separately from you, again, like we were talking earlier. It's that you, as a conscious being, have projected yourself into this mold or image of yourself as a socially responsible being. And if you don't behave that way, it creates a dissonance, which then produces the sense of ought. I ought to be doing this because I project and see myself as that thing.
Okay, so
And
last
I don't see myself as a citizen of Japan, so I don't have an ought feeling that I should pay taxes there or Canada. But I do perceive myself as a citizen of the United States, and so I have that ought feeling because of my relationship with that categorical perception.
Gotcha. So I'm tracking what you're saying. So the ought, the moral ought is essentially a feeling of dissonance you specify.
Yeah.
But okay, so I want to raise that epistemic problem that you raised to us. And
Okay.
it's not subjective relativism, but someone might charge you of societal relativism. Because let's say the conditions are, in terms of the morally relevant circumstances, they're the exact same. I'm in Nazi Germany society versus United States of America in the 21st century,
Mhm.
and we have those conditions that are all the morally relevant ones are all the same with respect to these things. Are you saying how would we know that we? In that case, you would have to say we ought to kill the Jews in that society. That's not what's. I'm not going to feel any dissonance because this is what's leading to the Germans getting out of the Great Depression. That everything's going good. We're
Well,
getting
it's a global generalization that falls apart because you again, you're talking about millions of individuals. And I'm sure that within those individuals, there were sociopaths and psychopaths who are just as happy to take Jews and make them into lampshades and buttons and put them in ovens, and they were just fine with it. But I I don't know, but I'm guessing that there was a huge proportion of those people who felt a moral dissonance. And from fear of retaliation, fear of their family, they suppressed it, they repressed it, they pushed it down, they pushed it to the side. I don't know what's going on over in that place, off switch. I don't see it. I see nothing. I hear nothing, because of pure fear, right? So, but I would think that a majority of the people, a huge majority,
is
would
that
have felt a dissonance, and they
is
would have
that
felt.
is that how you determine it based on the majority of
No, I'm saying that you can't make a global statement. If you're a citizen of Germany in World War II, you will feel this. Well, no, it's a case by case basis. It's an individual by individual basis. So you can't make that global argument. That's like saying that if I'm a citizen of America in the 21st century, therefore I will think it's okay to commit abortion because so many people are doing it. No, of course not. It's a case by case basis. You can't make that global generalization. It leads to a bad argument.
Okay, so last question then, and I'm going to hand it to David because I see he wants to come in. But okay,
Okay.
so let's take that global thing, right? Because if we look globally at the majority of humans throughout human history, we can find certain things where they were like, yeah, you ought to do what we would consider morally wrong now. So slavery could be the majority of humans throughout history have seen nothing immoral about slavery. Most of them would probably say it was good. Look, we're helping them. We're civilizing them. We're giving them the opportunity to work. I mean, slavery in the Roman Empire was a totally different thing. I mean, people
Mhm.
voluntarily went into this.
Slavery in the Bible. The Old Testament is full of slavery,
Exactly,
right?
and this was a way to advance your career in some cases, if
Mhm.
to prevent your family from starving to death. So
Right.
if we look at the global communities across time, and
Mhm.
even count the majority,
Right.
I think we could find certain things that I would say you morally ought not to do, but the vast majority of people felt no dissonance about that.
Right, because we humans are, as we've said many times, absolutely imperfect. That's the only absolute, is that we're imperfect, and it's consistent in all times and places. So what we now today, after many many years and generations of warfare and fighting and debating and coming to agreement and consensus on, we can't hold them responsible for that from our perspective, right? We can't go back in history and say the Romans were bad for having slaves because we've determined it's bad, right?
But so that's
Why would we even do, what's the point of doing that? It doesn't change or affect anything. All we can do is deal with the existential reality of where we are
so
today.
here's my question then. I think you'll get this.
Uh,
So I'm here today. I'm not really doing this. Don't go after me in the
oh, no,
audience.
no, no, no.
Hypothetically, I'm here today and I'm saying, look, we've screwed up. The vast majority of human beings throughout all of human history, they all agree slavery is good. Therefore, today we ought to bring back slavery. And
But
I'm
that's
trying.
that's a logical proposition. Again, that ought is a logical proposition. It is not the emotive human response that gives you that feeling of ought, isn't it? That is a disconnected proposition based on a logical argument. But that's what my whole point is. That's not the way morality happens. It happens on an emotional reaction. If I see, okay, thousands and thousands of girls being kidnapped all around the world today and sold into sex slavery on the black market, okay, that's freaking awful. That's horrible. I perceive it as absolutely disgusting and reprehensible.
Mhm.
Of
But
course I That's that's our emotional reaction, right? So
yeah,
that's the difference between, that's why I don't like syllogistic arguments and things like, it's not that I can't follow them. I just don't like them because they're disconnected from the existential reality of our existence, because
exactly.
we are complete creatures. And so we have to deal with our whole complete self when we discuss these kinds of issues. You can't just
I
make some hypothetical,
No, but
right?
it's not. I'm incorporating all those emotions, loving doing slavery, loving doing all these things, and that's the complete human experience. And I've realized my individual feelings are today would be wrong, kind of thing. I need to change. So there's a disconnect in what you're saying. You seem to be on the one hand saying, yeah, but you personally, Dale, would have this individual feeling that I would have a feeling of dissonance if I was arguing
Good,
to bring back
right?
slavery.
You would,
I would have.
because you can't separate your own personal history from all from from the question, right?
Yeah,
You can't sincerely tell me that you're going to feel that slavery is okay, right?
right,
I mean, you
right.
can't,
I can't.
because you're the creature who you are, based on your history and the history of all the people in your family and your whole society going back thousands of years. That's what's brought you to who you are and where you are today. So you
So it
can't do
seems
that.
like the ought
And you know
is
what? And
really
those kind of
right.
arguments, and I'm not picking on you. I'm making a side point. Those are the kind of ways that people like Jim Jones manipulate people and Hitler manipulate people. They go and they create a false logical narrative that people don't quite have the parsing skills to be able to disagree with and to know how to find the logical error, and then they bamboozle them into believing it, and once they believe the false logical proposition, they go and act on it, and it becomes a self-reinforcing thing. That's how you get millions of people to kill millions of other people, is that kind of disconnected, dissociated reasoning, where you create this felonious argument and then bake it into their head, use their circumstances and their desperation and whatever kind of angst or problem they have as a leveraging point, and then you can manipulate crowds to do that. You can get people to drink that Kool-Aid because you are disconnecting them from their emotional center and from their self. because you are disconnecting them and wrapping their mind up in this little bubble of ideas that they don't have the skills to parse through.
Fair enough, and I guess I'm one of the cult followers then, because I
Oh
do
yeah.
sincerely think that this is an Achilles heel. I do think this is a good way, because it is kind of reducing down to, you should do what you feel, based on your dissonance or not. That's really what the odd is. It's not about the society's odds, although that may impact what I personally feel, but there is nothing you can say to this person who's feeling the opposite and having this assonance feeling or whatever it is.
It depends, I guess. I mean, some people, everyone's not a psychopath or a sociopath. It depends on the person, right? There are people who, and we've all done this. Someone's doing something wrong, and they're cheating on a test, and you say, "Come on, man, you shouldn't be doing that." And then they go, "Okay, you're right," and then they undo or whatever. That people have this gray area, and most people do have an emotive capacity that, if they have been misled in a way of thinking, that you can talk to them, bring them back to reality. And there are people who have absolutely no compunction whatsoever and will do whatever appears convenient at the time. And those are psychopaths, and there's a small proportion of those in society. And, that, that also they also create an interesting problem with the moral argument, right? Because God has created people who have no capacity for moral agency. And what do you do with that? Or yeah, well, no, that's correct. With no moral agency, their moral agency is just do whatever they want, and whatever they can get away with.
David Wood's a good example. They do have, this is why the knowledge in those pesky little propositions are most important moral truths, because those do speak to even the person who doesn't have values or disvalues. They still know it's wrong. And David Wood smashed his dad with a hammer over trying to kill him and went to jail. He's one of the most famous Christian apologists today, right? He knew it was
Who's
wrong.
that?
David Wood, he's
Oh, I
Islamic.
think I know who he is. Yeah, yeah, he still comes across like a psychopath. I'm sorry.
He's
I've watched him.
he's
He
clinically,
is.
yeah.
He's still got something really wrong with him. But
There is, yeah. He's got a medical condition. I'm not
yeah,
insulting him. He's actually got.
I'm not trying to insult him either. It's a kind of disability, I guess you could look at it that way. And you know, it's really weird when now I'm going off onto a whole tangent, but
David,
it's
after he's
really
done,
weird. There was a neurologist who was doing a study on sociopaths and psychopaths in prison, and he was doing MRIs on their brains. And he was looking at the MRIs to determine if there was a correlation in certain brain structures with sociopathy and psychopathy. And he did find a correlation. Sociopathy is something that's learned and can be, gotten around, but psychopathy, you know, is actually the little part of the brain. I can't remember which structure it is that's associated with psychopathy, is all shriveled up like a little raisin in psychopaths, and they just physically can't generate emotion, or not emotion, but empathy.
Mhm.
And what was really interesting is that this neurologist, okay, was doing a control study for the MRI to make sure the MRI machine was reading correctly. And he did an MRI on himself. And his MRI got mixed up with everyone else's, and he identified it as a psychopath's MRI. You know about this?
I don't.
And oh, yeah, he identified it as a psycho. And then he realized, oh my God, I'm a psychopath. And he reevaluated his whole life. He was married with kids. He was a good guy, and he was doing everything right the way he was supposed to. But suddenly, this guy realized he's a psychopath. So it makes you wonder how many people are psychopaths like that out there that don't even know it, that have just kind of gone along with all the rules of society just out of enculturation, and really don't have that emotive, empathic grounding for it.
Well,
So it's interesting.
well, that's okay. Well, here's a good challenge then, because there are obviously these cases of these people that, by definition, medically speaking, they just cannot have this feeling of dissonance, which
Or
you
empathy,
equate.
yeah, empathy, which creates the feeling of dissonance. Yeah.
Right. And you equate that to the moral odds, but that they can't be identical, because there are these people that they live their lives and they recognize intellectually there are moral odds.
Yes.
So how
Yes.
do we
That's
explain
an
that?
intellectual recognition. But okay, look, I mean, okay, so this object is small, and this object is bigger, right?
Mhm.
Okay. Does that mean there's an absolute bigness somewhere and codified in the universe, independent from the objects? It is an abstraction that we infer by judging the properties of these things.
Yeah, it's a
And and
relation.
and then bigness becomes a category, and it becomes a thing that we can all talk about and understand. But bigness does not exist as a thing in the universe. It does not exist as an independent entity. Okay, it's not an objective truth. It is a a universally agreed upon subjective truth, which de facto, for practical purposes, makes it objective, but it's not really objective in the sense that the existence of this object is objective. Does
Mhm.
that make sense? So I think a lot of times people make a confusion when they talk about objective truth. If we all or almost all agree that something is true, and we all feel it the same way, then we treat it as objective. We feel like it's objective. We assume it's objective. And until it's pointed out to us that it's not, we might never stop thinking of it that way.
I
So
Yeah.
if everybody agrees subjectively on the same thing, it's pragmatically non-different from being objective, but that doesn't mean ontologically it's actually objective, right?
Yeah.
We agree. Everybody with eyeballs will agree that this is bigger than this.
Yeah, because the relation is objective, right? And but bigness isn't really a property. It's just it's an
Exactly.
invented thing that you just invented.
Well, it's an abstraction, right?
Oh,
And so,
well, Plato might say there's a thing called relational properties.
uh-huh,
I don't. I Most philosophers today don't believe in that nonsense, but the
right.
ancient Greeks would say there are relational properties. That
Sure, he saw it that way. And Plato was a cool guy and a deep thinker, and there are things I agree with him on, things we don't agree with him on. And it's been 2,000 years, so I give him 2,300 years. I give the guy a break.
fair
But
enough. All
you
right.
know, but so that's kind of what I'm saying also about objective morals. We all agree, that not only is this is objectively measurably bigger than this, but the perception of bigness, right? That's something that's up here.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm saying also in relation to objective moral values, things that we all seem to universally agree are wrong, like chopping up little babies for fun. Okay. We all say, oh, well, objectively it's wrong. No, we all subjectively agree that it's wrong. That makes it, relatively objective, but not objectively independent from us.
Okay. Well, how? Okay. So William and Craig's argument, right? He defines what when he's saying objectively, he means God, the subject, the moral subject, God, who we ought to defer
Right.
to,
So
says
then
it's.
it's still
But
subjective.
here's my question:
Mhm.
your argument is no, it's not. There is no objectivity at all. It's just intersubjectiveness among humans.
Well,
Um,
I mean, now we're talking about just the platform of common dealings. If we want to bring God into it, we can still say that it is God being the supreme subject still makes it subjective, just not relative the way it is among us.
Yeah. Okay. But you would agree that there is that objective component that causes the supreme subject or the intersubjectivity of masses to respond in a certain way.
I'll go
Right?
with that. I can go
Okay,
with it.
cool. Then we would totally agree on that front. Here's what I want to ask you as the final question, and then we'll go to
Sure.
closing words. You
Okay.
are arguing, you bear the burden of proof on this one because it's your argument. How
Sure.
do you know that it's not the supreme subject that grounds these moral values and truths, and it's instead this intersubjectivity? What's your reason?
From the ultimate scope, I don't see that. I don't see a problem with that. I just think, again, that the syllogism of the moral argument, as I've seen it presented, does not do a good job of proving it. So there's a difference between agreeing. Look, the only reason this has any existence or value or meaning is because God exists. It doesn't exist without God. It doesn't exist independently from him. None of its properties exist. So ultimately, I agree with that proposition. I'm just saying the moral argument doesn't work to prove it, as I've seen. The argument is not a valid argument. It doesn't mean that the conclusion is wrong, like I said earlier.
So do
So
you
I do believe that the supreme subject makes things, it gives a universality to things. If God decides that, this is made out of carbon, then by God, it's going to be made out of carbon for everybody, right? That
Mhm.
doesn't mean that if you remove man and God from the equation, that the carbon would still exist. It's meaningless without God, right? So I'm just saying that, yes, you're right. The way you said it was great, is that the supreme subject, sets the ground conditions and determines that all these little subjects can have this interrelated subjectivity, a subjective agreement.
Mhm.
I agree with you. I
Okay.
just think that the moral argument, as it's the syllogism that I've seen, does not prove it. It's a bad argument. And why am I so hot on it? It's because when we go out and make bad arguments, it makes it when that someone can come and knock that argument down, and then it calls into question everything you say. And that's why I hate bad arguments. It's because, you may have a person who's arguing from the right place, but if you use a bad argument and then someone like Christopher Hitchens comes in there with a crowbar and pries your argument apart, it doesn't just invalidate your argument, it invalidates everything you say because now everything becomes suspect. So that's why I want people to make good arguments.
Okay. So, one last question, just to answer is a yes or no, and then I'm going to
Sure.
go to David for his closing word here. But so, are you saying in terms of proof? Not because I get that you believe along the lines of the moral argument, right?
Mhm.
The supreme subject, and then he designs the intersubjectivity. But do you think that in terms of proof, William Lane Craig's moral argument, for God, kind of the supreme subject, as you call him,
Mhm.
and the secular art explanation for what we call moral truths and values, and or your explanation, your argument, are all equally probable on the evidence? Do you see certain hypotheses are more probable than the other?
Well, again, mine is very much of more of a kind of an existential argument. I think you have to consider as a whole the nature of consciousness, the nature of the soul, the nature of embodiment of consciousness in the flesh, full of fleshy desires and narcissistic nature, and also longing for ultimate goodness and purity. And you have to take that whole package and look at it as a much larger thing that can be you can't distill it to a syllogism. It's just not going to work. You have to understand a bigger picture for me. And William Lane Craig's argument, like I've said, it makes the very first if statement. To accept that statement means you're already accepting the existence of God, but that's the very thing he's trying to prove. And if there's something else to it that I'm missing, I'm free. I want to listen to you. And if you can't, don't have time to verbalize it now, throw me an email and we'll do a part 2 on the discussion.
Yeah.
But from what I see, it's a trickster, and I don't think he's intentionally trying to be a huckster, but it's a bad argument, because it starts off with, to accept his first proposition, even as an if proposition, assumes the existence of God and then tries to prove it, and then tries to prove that existence. I think it's bad. And of course, the other kind of argument that people use, they come out with the sledgehammer, is just terrible, because it's a blunt object, and it completely ignores the actual reality of what human experience and morality are.
All right, David, you're over to you for your closing word, and unmute yourself would help.
Woo! Yeah, I mean, we've been going at it for a while.
How long have you been on?
Yeah, about 2 hours almost.
Oh God, we always go 2 hours, don't we, Dale?
Yeah,
2 to 2.5 hours. We can't keep it to an hour, man.
yeah. Well, I wasn't aiming for an hour, anyways. So.
I think I mean, I'm trying to piece a lot of this together. I would go at a moral argument, and I'll use a moral argument that I got my moral argument from, and start with the idea that morality is a rational enterprise. Moral realism is true, meaning that moral facts and duties actually do exist. The moral problems and disagreements among humans are too much for us to assume moral facts and duties are grounded in a human source of rationality. Moral facts and duties are grounded in a necessary rational source. And I think this source is what we call God. So at the end of the day, like, I really do think that we are discovering moral facts that really do go beyond our cognition, and I think that uh, um, that these moral facts help us better operate in reality. And overall, I think a lot of your objections that I've witnessed, I just come back to that, this is all a part of the moral realism argument, which deduces things like the argument from epistemic realism, moral disagreement, which we spend a lot of time on, experience, intuition, all these things that go into it. And when it comes to moral disagreement and so forth like that, I think, like, moral actions, moral disagreements, they really are manifestations of the fact that there is an objective idea of moral facts, or not idea, but there are objective moral facts. So I would stand firm on that and the moral argument that I presented, because I do think that's a very good argument, and it doesn't start with if God. It starts with morality is a rational enterprise. And I think if we go about it like that, that it would be able to maybe entice you more into looking into some of the meta ethical books that I would suggest, such as Andrew Fisher's book and so forth. So and there's others that I could cite to you as well, but I won't right now. So it's just a lot. I think I've said enough. So I'll hand it back over to you, Dale, to do whatever you got to do.
Yeah, cap up.
All right, cool. So yeah, I guess my recap of the debate is, look, I fully agree, and so does David, so does William Lane Craig, with Omar's main point that a moral subject is at least partially needed to ground moral values and duties and moral truths. That's what the moral argument is designed to do, to say, hey, that's God. So that is true, right? But I'm able to agree with William Lane Craig's argument as stated. It's just a matter of, look, you have to define, what do you mean by objective? And he defines that, right? He's just saying, look, it's not grounded in human will or arbitrary opinions or something like that. That's how he defines objective for the purposes of his argument. So I totally agree with his argument on that front, as stated, kind of thing, right? But I think it is important, because with the objective subjective distinction, I think it does cause things. I've had debates with David Johnson, the atheist, where on Skeptics and Seekers, where he gets confused by this very thing. But you're saying it's objective, so it's independent of minds and wills, but yet you're saying it's grounded in the mind and will of God, or the character of God is technically
Mhm.
where moral values come from, and moral truths are grounded in God's mind. Those are the internal aspects of God that ground it. God's a subject, right?
Mhm.
We do need to be careful, and that's why I prefer to make my argument about necessary moral truths and values that are true and or apply in every possible world. That's the approach that I think would be more beneficial. Obviously, it can be difficult trying to prove to someone who would deny that there are necessary moral truths or necessary moral values that apply in every possible world. I think all I can say is kind of appeal to your properly based beliefs, your moral conscience,
Mhm.
to produce knowledge within you that there's at least one moral true proposition that's true in every possible world. There is, not torturing innocent babies for fun. That is something that ought to be valued in every possible world. You either know that or you don't. But yeah, I don't have an objective way to prove that other than probing you and trying to say, look, tell me what set of circumstances could ever morally justify torturing an innocent baby for fun. You say those Japanese people did that, cool. I'll say it's the fall, but you tell me, Mr. Skeptic,
Mhm.
what was the circumstances that justified morally those Japanese people butchering those Chinese people for fun? There's nothing. It's just
It was
impossible.
an amoral decision. It had nothing to do with a moral decision involved in it.
It
It
doesn't
was
matter.
just an animalistic activity. Just like if a
That's relevant.
psychopathic rapist grabs a girl, drags him into his van, takes him to, some house, some basement somewhere, and abuses her for a couple of weeks and then kills her, there's no moral decision being made on his part. He is beneath that. He's acting like an animal. He's going on instinct, he's going on desire, and he didn't sit down and make a moral decision.
Cool, irrelevant. It's still moral whether he knows it or not, right? We're not talking moral epistemology here. He made a moral decision whether he was aware of it or not. It was the choice. He torturing an innocent baby for fun is inherently moral in nature. So maybe we're not aware of it. That's cool. But for the point that I'm making
Mhm.
is, ontologically speaking, it's a necessary truth that was immoral,
Right.
what they did. So yeah, in terms of Omar's argument, it's an interesting argument. Obviously, it's founded upon certain
Mhm.
Hindu assumptions based on metaphysics
Well,
that
they're not just Hindu, but I mean, it's based on a soul-body dualism.
it's
Right?
yeah
It's not just
it's
that, because a lot of people, a lot of historically, even there are a lot of Christians who believe in soul body dualism, right? They're a little bit more platonically influenced. There have been those, and I don't want to go back to that whole argument right now, but there's even cause for believing it right there in the New Testament, that there is a soul and a body and they're separate. And I'll just throw out there that in the Gospel of John, Jesus tells the guy on the cross, the thief on the cross, "You will dine with me in heaven tonight." So his body's not going up to heaven, his soul is. And that's what Jesus is referring to. So I think that there, even in the New Testament, there is cause to believe that there is a soul independent from the body that at death becomes dissociated from it. And that's the belief that you need in order to make my thing work. It's not just a Hindu thing. You just need to see that distinction between consciousness and matter.
Yeah, it's
I do.
dualism. Yeah. Go
Well,
ahead.
Huh?
Go
I
ahead,
think
Dale.
there's more metaphysical assumptions that are not consistent with Christianity that are in there a little bit, but yeah, like dualism, we don't have a problem with. I'm a dualist, but okay, yeah. So
Believe
so
there's
how?
a soul separate from the body?
I'm sorry.
You believe there's a soul separate from the body?
I believe my body is a manifestation of my soul. It's a necessary and essential part of it. It can be separated at the moment of biological death, but I don't take a Cartesian view of the soul. I take
We're
a
gonna have to talk about that again then, because I wanna get more of what you're trying to say. I know we did a whole show on it, but, you know, maybe we can discuss it again, you know?
Okay. Okay, cool. All right, cool. So my last point for my closing statement is So I don't, in terms of explaining moral truths, necessary or objective moral truths, values, and duties, especially with duties, I do think that Omar's explanation is improbable relative to the God explanation. I think it it lacks explanatory power in explaining some of the is odd problem that we brought up. And I also think it's equal too. So one of the problems brought up against the God explanation was moral epistemology disagreement and confusion. But I think the Christians have an equally probable explanation where we talk about sin and the corruption of our faculties. That's equal to what Omar offered. He's, well, the matter is just inherently imperfect, and that's why these situations erupt. Okay, if true, hypothetically, that would explain why there are these disagreements. It's the same with the Christians. So I don't think it works as a defeater. They're kind of equal on that playing field. So that's kind of my closing statement. So my assessment. So yeah, great show today. We've got 0 in the audience. They've given up, but
Oh, well.
we had Richard Hunter come in and give.
They realize you're from Canada.
They
Is that what it was? Yeah.
realized, yeah, I'm not drinking milk out of a bag, so
You
they're
gotta
not
start
interested.
spoofing your IP and change your accent.
There we go. The Yankee Real Seeker. All right, cool. Well, yeah, thanks for coming on.
Cool.
I hope it was helpful. I was trying to bring some structure to it, so hopefully that was I highlighted
Yeah,
it.
I do. You know, since when I first wrote you that letter, that email, I have seen that there's a tremendous amount of scholarship and thought that has gone into the moral argument, and it's not just that simplified, oversimplified Kantian argument that is, you know, dumbed down for preschoolers. I'm sorry. I think it's just a terribly bad way to argue the point. And you know, it's just it really misses the whole point. But I'm glad to see that there are people who have spent, of course, the whole field of ethics, and people have devoted their lives to it, and not just ethics, but as an abstracted field, but also, religious thinkers, and have really, like, who is that fellow's name? That I like him a lot. I just don't remember his name now. The guy I mentioned that you ought to try to get on the show. He's like the king of the moral argument.
It's his first name starts with a D, but I can't remember.
I can't remember his name.
Daniel or something.
I can't remember. But obviously there are people who spend a lot of time and work, like also yourself, David, obviously, and Dale, probing into the question and trying to look at it in depth, and look at it as a much bigger thing than just a simple black and white propositional argument. So.
Gotcha. All right, cool. Well, yeah, that's it. I guess coming up next week, so that everyone knows. So I've got 2 Shroud-related shows coming up. So I have my panel review show coming on, where we're focusing on the scientific evidence. So specifically evaluating the traditional painting hypothesis for multimachrome. And additionally, I'm going to be a guest on the Guy Powell's podcast on Friday. Again, just kind of giving my minimal relevant features approach to the Shroud and applying it to certain hypotheses to see how that works. So that's what I've got coming up next week. But have a great week, everyone.
Thanks, Dale.
All right.
You gonna hang back, Dale? Hey, see